Happy Friday, everybody. Thanks for joining again at our weekly, we try to do this almost weekly, Friday privacy chat, where we take a couple of minutes to catch up with either some of the FPF staff who've been working on interesting issues or other guests. So do tell me who you'd like to hear from, because people are pretty commenting. You call them up and you say, let's go live. And interesting people with stuff to say is who we want to speak to. So thanks for Amelia Vance, who leads our education, student data, privacy work. Anisha Reddy, a senior member of the team who played a big role in advancing this project and is a key leader for us. So if you don't know them, please take a look at studentprivacycompass.org, which is the dedicated FPF website where we talk not just to the wonks, who probably are the people at FPF.org, the policymakers, the regulators. The mass audience is typically not who we're writing for. We're trying to really get into the weeds on some wonky stuff. But the student world, obviously, is a much broader constituency, parents and teachers and school districts and administrators and Department of Education and advocates. And so much of the work we do there, which is often written, sometimes even specifically for a teacher audience, right? Super smart folks, but aren't necessarily experts on all things data protection law, but increasingly are expected to, because they're making decisions about apps. They're dealing with increasingly a lot of student digital information, right? In the world of COVID, they're Zoom experts, and so one of the goals of the team has been to help those communities, to provide them with the resources they need so they can tap in to the smart work that's going out there. So please do take a look, and you'll find a vast amount of really useful material. But today we want to talk about a recent report that the team did. We'll post a link to it, that took a look at, frankly, a technology that I haven't had a lot of experience with. And I've been dealing with tech and data for a long, long time. But this isn't something where, unless you maybe worked in a school system, maybe in a library, people may know of the law that's relevant here that requires actually schools and libraries to take some action. SIPA, I'm going to let the team sort of talk about it. So first of all, what is the technology? I think, Anisha, you're going to lead off with us. What are we talking about? What is this technology? Who's using it? What's the purpose? Is it legally obligatory? Some people are calling for bans on it. What are we dealing with here? This is not about big tech and ads and tracking. This is sort of a safety type thing, but go ahead.
Yeah, so the technology that we talk about in our report is, in particular, we're talking about self-harm monitoring technology. So when the broader technology is being used to identify kids that might be at risk of self-harm or suicide. But the monitoring technology that's underlying it is typically used by schools, like you mentioned, Jules, to comply with SIPA, the Children's Internet Protection Act. So about 95% of schools receive funding from the FCC under E-rate to provide students with technology, access to internet, computers, et cetera. When the law was enacted, though, schools typically provided students with access to this technology in the classroom or in a computer lab. And SIPA actually includes a monitoring and filtering requirement. So schools are required to monitor what kids have access to on school devices, on school provided internet that's funded by E-rate, to make sure that they're not accessing inappropriate content. So for example, violent content or sexually explicit content, things like that. And in addition to that, they're also required to filter that. So make sure that their networks don't provide students with access to that inappropriate content. But that, as you can imagine, has radically changed as schools have changed since the law was enacted. So students are accessing the internet through school-issued devices, school-issued hotspots, and in some cases, they're logging into school accounts on their personal devices. And the monitoring technology that we're talking about in this report actually it takes shape in different forms. So there's a lot of different companies out there that are offering services to help schools with their SIPA compliance. In some cases, this technology is monitoring just the network on the computer. So it's monitoring the web traffic to understand what students have access to and make sure that they're able to filter that out, the inappropriate content out. In some cases, it's also monitoring the students' shared drives and things like that, the files that the students have access to. And in some cases, the monitoring is only happening on the school-issued accounts. So if a student is logged into a school account, it's monitoring the content that they have access to, or what they might be providing or uploading into those accounts. And when we say monitoring, sometimes this is keyword searches. So if a student is looking up problematic content, it knows to block it or alert school officials. And in some cases, the technology also incorporates artificial intelligence or machine learning to understand if a student is searching something that might be inappropriate and what to do next. So that's kind of just an overview of the technology itself. And in particular, we focused on self-harm monitoring. So this technology can be deployed in a variety of ways outside of simply monitoring for inappropriate content. So sometimes we're seeing schools use it to determine whether or not a student might be at risk of, putting other students at risk at school. So if they're considering harming other students and things like that, or if they're looking up guns or violent or problematic content, to flag that to school staff to help them understand that they might need to intervene or stop a harmful event from occurring. But the self-harm monitoring technology is actually making inferences about what a student is thinking or might be thinking of doing to themselves. So there might be some straightforward searches, like a student searching, how to harm themselves online. That might result in a flag to school staff to say, hey, this student is potentially going to harm themselves and things like that. So that's really what our report is focusing on here.
So a student posts, oh my God, I want to kill myself, which I think I've heard a lot of teens say, hundreds of times a day because, all the random things that happen in a teen's life, and it's not a serious thing. On the other hand, maybe it is a serious thing. Is the theory that the AI is somehow assessing whether a comment like that is, a teen joke or, a serious warning? Can it, do the companies that provide this claim they can even make those sorts of distinctions?
So I think that's one of the major challenges that we're seeing in this space. So there are jokes that students can be making. There are, students have, kids in the middle school have a completely different vocabulary than we do. They're using different jargon and things like that. And on top of that, there are English language learners who use English differently than other kids, than their peers. So those are all different challenges that arise in this space. And we actually highlight a bunch of those in our report because there are serious challenges to taking things out of context.
There's also issues in conflating self-harm content with monitoring for mental health generally. So one of the things that we're particularly concerned about is, when does a school cross the threshold of just monitoring something like how to tie a noose, which is obviously something where you do want an immediate intervention, versus a student looking up, typing into Google, "I'm so sad," or depression, or other things like that. And how does the school take action? Do they have a system set up in the school to actually help students, or is this just identification without a plan afterwards? And is it more likely that students may not look up community help, may not seek out LGBT forums, for example, or may not search out, mental health websites that could help them because they're being monitored? So oftentimes we're not just talking about monitoring the really obvious self-harm or suicidal ideation content, but mental health generally. And at some point, that starts to get pretty invasive and pretty creepy, because most of the content being flagged is happening after school hours while students are at home, often in their bedrooms at 3 or 4 in the morning.
The report raised some questions, I think, looking at some of the research or lack of research. I mean, does this stuff even work? I mean, obviously, if we're saving a lot of lives and you can point to that, then we can get to the downsides. But there's, some strong argument to be made that maybe the downside is worth dealing with because it's really doing some good. Do we have any evidence? Has there been much research that shows that schools are managing timely interventions that are, important?
There's not really any independent research that indicates that. What we do have are anecdotes from schools that have found extremely, have been able to intervene in extremely troubling cases, but there isn't any widespread research that indicates at a broad level that this is working, or the risks of the invasiveness of this technology versus the benefits are really there.
So obviously, clearly somehow we need to figure out how to facilitate the research to know whether or not this is the most effective way to do this work. Is it money that should be spent on counselors and other sorts of support? This is a challenging kind of research to do. We are part of an effort elsewhere to see whether there are ways that independent researchers can get broader access to school data, but obviously that comes with, concerns,
privacy risks,
right? On the other hand, we will never know what works if we don't figure out privacy protective, ethical ways to do some work. But there are those that really believe that this is, bad and dangerous. Albert Fox-Kahn of Stop Surveillance Now, did I say it right? Leading advocacy group based in New York, and others have called for bans because they're concerned about kids being labeled unfairly, kids being labeled and putting on lists. What's the downside here, other than it can be creepy, obviously, to your content is being monitored?
I think a lot of those risks come with what happens next, the what happens next question. So if a student is flagged, if a student is identified, there are significant risks for at one level, if there's not enough staff expertise at the school. One, there's a risk of bias and stigmatization if one kid is identified as potentially being depressed or suffering from mental health concerns. Then there's other risks specific to already marginalized student populations. So, for example, if a student is identified as at risk of harming themselves or potentially depressed, and they are maybe they're Black or brown, and they are viewed potentially as, a threat of violence, basically, there's a risk that there is going to be disproportionately referred to law enforcement. We already know that Black and brown students are disproportionately disciplined in schools. So what the downstream effects are really reliant on what the school's processes are, because there is a very high risk of inequitable treatment and disparate treatment to students.
Unfortunately, related, that you have that stigma that Anisha was talking about, where there is sort of this persistent and unfortunately growing inaccurate belief that people with mental health issues are dangerous, are more likely to be violent, which is not at all the case. They're more likely to be victims of violence. And so there really is this potential, not only that this could, be creepy to students, could prevent them from getting help, but that they could be inaccurately labeled as violent or as somebody that schools need to watch in order to, protect all students. And I think some of the advocates have a fair point that, if it is unclear if this works, other than those anecdotal examples, why are we spending money on it? Why are schools investing so heavily in this versus school counselors or other things where we really do have a research relationship? And it's hard to say because, again, we do have anecdotal examples, and this is the sort of thing where you stop a middle schooler from committing suicide or from self-harm. That's That's everything that matters. But it really does need to be balanced and need to figure out, well, are there other measures? Are there things like anonymous reporting? Because oftentimes kids will tell their friends how they're feeling. Have you made sure that the school community feels comfortable coming to a trusted adult when they're feeling bad or a friend is feeling bad? So what are the alternatives there? How do we balance all of these equities?
How widespread? It sounds like whether it's because of SIPA obligations or just awareness of the technology or the sales of the companies. It sounds like this is actually fairly wide and ubiquitous. Are most public schools, many? What's the extent of the deployment of this? Is it fairly new that the kind of more specific self-harm monitoring is part of the capability that the companies offer?
So we don't have any numbers on how many districts are specifically using the self-harm layer of monitoring here. As Anisha stated, 95% of school districts receive E-rate funds, are subject to some sort of monitoring requirement of their networks, of school devices. And so most of them have some sort of system or software that has the capability to do this. And many of the companies that provide that monitoring capability have this additional service on top of it that can monitor. But we just don't know how many schools have actually adopted it, and weren't able to find any information in our research.
Well, let's mention the companies for a second. One critic argued that this is all about big tech, the big global tech companies. This isn't, as I understand, the kind of service that the Googles or the Facebooks and so forth, right? It seems like it's frankly a number of sort of startups that sell to schools that are the kind of the players here. Are they structured to be good custodians? I mean, they're collecting presumably a lot of very sensitive data. We certainly would want to know that it can't be sold, it can't be easily breached. What's the market on the business side? I've seen the Gaggles, the GoGuardians. There's a range of it's mostly smaller startups, right? And what's the maturity?
Startups and mid-sized companies, yeah. You have a number of them that started off when SIPA passed in late 90s, early 2000s, that started out really doing the filtering side of what SIPA requires. And so you have some companies that have been around for 20 years now. But you have some companies, especially those that have started aggressively offering these sorts of, AI scanned, machine learning based recommendations or information about students that were created in the past 10 years or so. And pretty much all of the self-harm monitoring software was just released, I'd say, in the past 5 years. So it's really new. But yeah, it's all companies that it's unlikely anyone has ever heard of, overwhelmingly. Or if they've heard of it, it's because their kid is in school right now and they may have gotten a notification that, their kid was flagged by software because they used a bad word or something.
So hopefully there are good contracts with the schools. Hopefully their privacy policies, is there a legal protection? I mean, they're intercepting communications. I guess there's a framework. Do we need more regulation here? Is this already sort of protected by different kinds of confidentiality? How transparent are these companies about what they do?
I mean, it's tricky. You have protections against the information being shared outside of the school, but the vast majority of privacy concerns are actually about what information is being shared inside the school. Is it just the school counselor who gets access to the flag that a student might have depression? Or is it available to the entire administration? Who is able to access this? How is the information shared or spread? Is it deleted at some point? You have some great school districts, like I think it's Montgomery County in Maryland, that have a data deletion week each year. And part of the data that they delete is the data from their monitoring software. So the slate is wiped clean. But while you have the protections and the knowledge that this information isn't being shared by companies, it is illegal for them to share it outside the school. We don't have the ethical frameworks or legally protecting laws that one would hope we would have about how the information can be used inside schools, whether and when parents will be told, how they can get access, since many parents don't even know that the software has been deployed unless their student has been flagged and some action has been taken by the school. So their student might have been flagged a number of times and they may not know about it because the school didn't do anything.
It's not necessarily a FERPA student record, just based on the collection of the data.
Probably is. It's messy because it's information that is being kept. I think most schools would interpret it as being part of the student's education record, but it's passively scanning. And so if it's just collecting information and passively scanning it, who has access to that information in the school could then determine which law applies and which rights. So 90% of the time, I mean, my best bet in interpreting FERPA is it's FERPA covered, parents have access. First of all, they have to know to ask. And second of all, some school districts might disagree on the interpretation there. And we don't have guidance on what they should be doing for sure.
That's what I was actually going to say. There's no explicit guidance on this, so it's tough. It's really about interpreting the legal requirements that are already in place and making sure that there's strong guardrails internally.
Julie G flags, are they contacting parents as soon as it happens, or is it a situation where the child is instantly labeled and police are called, etc.? The ideal situation is for the parents to get the child help. I think your recommendations perhaps are an answer to what schools should be doing. So maybe we can use that as a opportunity to turn to what you in the report. And before we jump into that, can we shout out Amelia, you and Anisha? We had another one or two members of the team who we should give a little credit to here as well. They're on the report. Who else should we be mentioning?
Yasmin Shariji, who's a fellow on our team currently. She did a fantastic job doing so much research and drafting of this report. Jasmine Park and Sarah Collins, who are no longer at FPF, had a hand in helping out develop out this report and author it as well. So definitely big shout outs to all of them.
Anisha, we're getting some real buzziness. Obviously, your line is being scanned for strange comments by whatever surveillance lives in between us and you in New York. So sorry for that to the audience. So maybe, Amelia, do you want to flag some of the other things that you told schools to do if they pass the bar of making sure they have some reason to actually use the technology based on whatever research and sense that it sort of meets the bar that it's worth their trouble. But you really laid out a high bar of the kinds of things that need to be done if one's going to consider using the technology.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first and foremost, it really is that question of are you just identifying students, or are you actually creating a program that you have conscientiously decided, okay, the benefits outweigh the risks, and we have the support system for students after they're identified. That's a major part of this. It's not enough to just identify students. You have to actually take care of them afterwards and make sure that they're going to be okay, that you have the support to help them in whatever way they need to be helped. Transparency is a major recommendation here, largely because, again, most parents don't know that this is happening, and we can't have a full conversation if the fact that it is happening is hidden to members of the community or to students themselves. And so making sure that there is discussion within a community. One of the things that I often talk about as a reason why a school district might deploy this software is in the case where you've already had a suicide and you're concerned about suicide clusters, where you know proactively that there's a likelihood that other students may commit suicide, and therefore you want to detect that. So really thinking strategically how it goes towards the school's goals. Anisha, what would you add?
I think also to Julie's point, it really varies on what those next steps are. So if a parent is immediately notified, if school staff are immediately notified, also please let me know if I'm still buzzing. Okay, great. So it really does vary. And I think making sure that there are these very strong processes that govern who is notified, how, really making sure that it is a small trusted group that is able to access this information is really, really important. One of the considerations we actually raise is that in some cases, parents might not be the one that you want to immediately go to. There should be an internal conversation, because in some cases it could be putting a child at risk at home if you're notifying the parent about what they were searching. So it really, really takes a lot of nuance and consideration before implementing this technology, how schools are really going to start building out their processes and making sure that the right people are clued in, that there are sufficient supports internally for students after they're flagged.
Yeah, it's always been frustrating to me working in, broader student privacy issues or even kid privacy issues. There's an audience that's always, parents have all the information. Parents should control everything. And I guess that's great in a lot of families where you can rely that there is a engaged, parent. But I fear that policymakers sometimes miss out. You can't use this without parental verification, parental permission. Well, there are kids who don't have parents, and there are kids who don't have, parents that are capable or able or willing, or in the worst cases, that are dangerous. And then, well, now do you not get access to basic communications tools that you need for, interacting with your friends and so forth, or certainly at the older end of the spectrum, teens start having a very deserved need for some degree of privacy, whether it's exploring sexuality issues or a range of other issues where sort of the heavy-handed parental permission is always the right model. So certainly hoping that policymakers see the room for nuance. I think schools get that because they do deal, with that. My mom, for a number of years, worked in the guidance office in a vocational school. Grady vocational school did a great job training some of the best car repair technicians and people who were really getting, super valuable skills. But when she would call around to find out, why a kid wasn't coming to school, she very often couldn't reach a parent, and eventually, would find the kid and the parent was incarcerated, right? And you don't have that mentality in a lot of policy worlds where, parental permission. Well, yeah, how about that's not going to be feasible? And so do these kids not get to, I don't know, get on the internet, use the school trip, right? Or some of the other challenges. Final thoughts. What did we not mention from the report that you think we should call out? And again, please, folks, worth reading, download it, read it online over the weekend. Welcome your thoughts, because the team's going to be continuing to work in this area. But any other key takeaways that we should mention?
I think one recommendation I would have wanted to fit in as well is giving students the opportunity to contest any decision that's being made is really, really important. So I mean, this might not be specific to self-harm, but in general, because I'm trying to think of a scenario where they might want to, I don't know if any of this information will be going into their disciplinary record or something, but if in the case it is, students should have the insight and the ability and the access to be able to contest any decision that's being made because of this technology as well.
Exactly, especially when you're dealing with linguistic challenges or slang or cultural phrases. I know there's some K-pop phrases that involve, I'm trying to remember, it's the word die or kill, just as a standard thing. And it's slang. It's not a threat. It's not an issue, but may very easily be taken as an issue. I think the one other thing to flag is that this will disproportionately target students of lower socioeconomic class. So if your parent can afford a device, if you're relying perhaps on a school hotspot over the course of this pandemic, if you're primarily using school internet to do homework, or in our lovely pandemic times to access life at all, to talk to family members, to talk to friends, you're being scanned. Whereas students who, whose parents can afford their own devices, can pay for their own internet, have much more privacy. And so you may have disproportionate punishment just based on the fact that some kids are more reliant on the school devices and network than others.
Amelia, Anisha, thanks for this amazing report. Really incredible work that the team is doing. Folks, do take a look at their work at Student Privacy Compass, or start at the FPF site and you can click over. Before I let you all go back to your day and work, let me also remind you that at fpf.org you can find information about our Understanding Digital Data Flows training program, where learning about how EdTech works, learning about how biometrics works, learning about the data flows that are relevant. So if you're in the policy or legal or world that is thinking about what the rules ought to be, let's start with understanding where and how the data goes. It's open to anybody. We charge a modest fee because we do like paying our staff. Everybody deserves to make a living. And so please do check that out. Thanks, everybody. Thanks to Nancy and Payal in the background for helping make things happen, and have a good day. Good weekend all.